May I now invite the Malcolm Adiseshiah awardee, Professor Surinder Singh Jodhka, to deliver the Malcolm Adiseshiah Memorial Lecture. Over to you, Professor.
Citation, one feels a little embarrassed, also very pampered, and obviously very happy. And I remember I was sitting with friends at home, some visitors had come from outside, and Dr. Selvaraj's phone came, and I felt so kind of, it's hard to describe that feeling. This is an award which I think every social scientist who is working hard aspires for. I think more important for me, for my generation of scholars, much more important for me than any other award, to be honest. Right? I received the Amartya Sen Award. It didn't mean that much to me as this award means. I think it's a really matter of great honor and privilege for me to be in this institute, to receive this award. It's in some sense, I feel very kind of, what one should say, satisfied that I have been able to achieve this. and this citation is so completely embarrassingly overstatement of all the work I've done. Thank you very much again to everyone, and to MIDS, to the director, to the chairperson, to Selvaraj, and I'm happy to be in the company of Vikas and be here. So I'll try not to speak for long. I've given you a text which is pretty long, and I realize that there are many typos. I need to work on it. I will eventually do that. And it's in some sense supplements the kind of thing that Vikas was saying, though it's supposed to be an award for development studies instituted primarily for economists. But I think even though Vikas is in Department of Economics, so I don't think economists, the mainstream economists in double quotes, will really accept him as an economist any longer with the kind of things that he was talking about. My work is also in some sense very similar, and it kind of tries to open up similar kind of conversations that in some sense question our common sense, our received wisdoms. And I'm talking about caste, and caste is perhaps one of the most contentious subject now all over India. Madras, in some sense, led that contestation. I'm talking about the Madras of the colonial period, where caste became one of the hottest subjects. And I suppose in contemporary Tamil Nadu also, it continues to be a very contentious, politically charged, academically very exciting and very interesting subject. And I think as academics, we should have the courage to take up these questions, which have also become, in some level, identity questions. And identity questions are hard to kind of engage with, but in some sense, all social science questions also end up becoming identity questions in one way or the other. So I've kind of very often felt very kind of defensive, not exactly defensive, but I feel sometimes, I'm trying to say something. Why are you not getting the point? Because then, identity of the social scientist also comes up, whether you are a Dalit or not. I'm not a Dalit. Whether you're Hindu or not, I'm not a Hindu. So all those questions also become very significant, and that's what social sciences are. I don't think they are in any way wrong questions. They're right questions, but also I think it kind of then puts a pressure on us to also make sure that the language that we use is rigorous enough, and it's not trying to, at some level, play a game, because in language all the time we are playing games in our everyday life, in our personal life. I'm not using it in a negative sense, but that's how human cultures are. So how does one think about futures of caste? And this question obviously seems like a very odd and bizarre question, because why should we even ask this question, right? The question that Indians have been asking since the early 20th century or late 19th century, not before that, is that, caste is something that has to go away. And this is how we, in some sense, imagined our modernity. And this is where the middle class, in some sense, has had this habit of thinking about caste as being somebody else's identity. And if you have become modern and middle class, you have already become, at some level, general category. General category, in some sense, is caste-free category by definition. So I think, caste is something very different from what it used to be in our imagination, perhaps 20 years back, 30 years back, or perhaps even 10 years back. And now it has come back to us in a very different way. So until recently, the question to be asked was, caste, since it's a signifier of tradition and backwardness, now that India is kind of moved on the path of development, and we have a kind of, vibrant democracy, whatever you may say about the actual outcomes and stuff like that, the fact that we are politics which has constantly had elections, and people on the margins seems to have more stakes in democracy because they have stakes in being recognized as citizens of this India. So caste is not something they want to celebrate, but still it's something that continues to persist. And if we just look at some of the basic indicators of India's development, they are there as economists, all of you know about it. But again, if one was to underline this point about India's urbanity, India's urban population, if you look at the numbers, urban population of India is larger than the total population of any other country in the world except for China and, of course, India, right? With 400 million plus urban population, urban India is larger than the total population of the third largest country. And this is not simply numbers. And we have seen since 2014 or maybe even earlier, urban middle class has also become very influential. It is setting the agenda. It is framing what kind of politics India should have. We do have this demographic classification into rural and urban, but anyone, like he's talking about numbers, who travels and who actually tries to figure out where the urban ends and where the rural begins, or where the rural ends and urban begins, even in interiors Chhattisgarh, it becomes kind of, difficult, anyone who moves around. So rural is now intensively mobile, not only physically in the sense that, majority of rural workers are employed in non-farm economy. Majority of rural incomes come from non-farm economy. And non-farm economy itself is a kind of shortcut by a shorthand thing by economists. Non-farm economy means many different things. India has always had a very large non-farm economy. That's a separate discussion. But otherwise also, if you look at Indian agriculture, 90% of Indian agriculture is now commercial agriculture. Everyone goes to the market, buys inputs. So rural resident is as much mobile as perhaps an average urban resident is, or maybe slightly lower than that. Even mentally and psychologically, we are very mobile people, and this is not, again, something which is confined to urban middle classes. India's elite, India's middle classes, even India's working classes are now globally integrated. You don't really know who are you working for. You could be working for a company based in Brazil or in California, and you could just be kind of working on a roadside. But otherwise also the working class India is very mobile. People who are working in Middle East, if you go, or otherwise also Israel, people from India were going to work there. So it's not only that the elite is globally integrated. India's working class is also globally integrated. And India's deepening democracy is something that we have already talked about, and it's been functioning. Caste has also changed, and we all know caste has changed. And even though, again, that's the point I want to make, the point that was also being stated in the citation, and my work has clearly shown, and this is something that all of us have been working on, and the sources of change have been many, right? Sources of change have been pressures coming from below, in form of assertions, conflicts, and these conflicts also lead to what my colleague James Manner calls as accommodations. In rural areas, in some places, you see phase of intense conflict, and then there is some kind of accommodation that, we let you be what you are. And then, there is kind of process of democratization that has happened everywhere. Pandyan's work here also shows that, how conflict has led to. Obviously, initiatives from above has also been equally significant. We have a very vibrant Dalit middle class which articulates caste in a very different language, and to which we are forced to respond in a very different manner. In some sense, paper like this is also coming from that. So reservations have been actually very, very successful. Even though one can find its criticisms, and one needs to kind of, work much more on reservations. They have not been worked on as much as they ought to have been. And there are legal protections for the marginalized groups, state-targeted policies, There have also been significant changes in caste coming from the side. I remember when I started working in late 1980s for my PhD on debt dependencies, rural Haryana, caste was changing, even though there was no intentional targeting of caste and a manner in which local Dalits who were also attached laborers or landless laborers, their lives were changing in many different ways. Their relations had anyway been formalized by the Green Revolution technology, but also they were kind of navigating their way through different difficulties of labor market. They'll go to town, they'll fight with their employer, and they would know that if they fight with their employer, they are not going to starve. So the opening up of rural economy and urbanization was already kind of changing caste in many different ways. And you can kind of extend it to changes in gender relations at the local level, democracy and growing associational lives of caste. Now you have caste associations at various levels. We know how politics works after Kashiram. You have a new kind of political agency where Dalit agency is also in some sense mobilized, articulated agency which talks about hissedari. Hissedari is my share in the politics as a collective identity. And that at some level, Hindu right wing also use that in dividing communities into sub-communities and stuff like that. So political agency in India has also become casteized, which has many implications, but it also implies that, you need to take care of every group and every community. But as I started in my lecture saying that, caste still persists, and the popular explanation of its persistence is that because there are vested interests, there are these political ethnic entrepreneurs which want to keep caste alive. We used to talk about people like Lalu Yadav, and they kind of ride on the wave caste. Middle class had that condescending attitude. And many people would also argue that if you did not have reservations, caste would have gone away by now. Caste is not really something that would stick to us just because it has been institutionalized. Or there are kind of people who are a little more considerate, and they would say that caste represents India's persistent backwardness, or the lots of people who are still ignorant. Only ignorant people have caste. We are civilized people, and they'll also get out of it. What we need to do is to spread education and stuff like that, and caste will go away. So there is this popular thesis in sociology that change has happened, but there's still some kind of tradition persists, and Indians are very traditional. So all this at some level presumes caste to be a state of mind. Right? Caste is something that exists in our Indian mind, and many people would say that caste persists because of Hinduism, because of Hindu mind. And then there is also a set of scholars, large number of them actually, who are very serious theoreticians, I'll come to that, which would say that caste doesn't exist any longer. Caste has actually gone away, and empirically that is not completely unfounded assumption. If you look at this room or classroom in any university, or even a village panchayat, or in bus transport and railways or water source, in most places in urban life or even in rural life, caste doesn't really matter. Even rural settlements are now increasingly becoming mixed. I remember when I was doing my fieldwork in Punjab, that was 20 years back, in many areas, this middle of the village has migrated out to the west. And in some cases, those houses were bought by Dalits. There was some resistance, but rural settlements are also becoming mixed. Slums, obviously, you have mostly poor people living there, but in terms of... So there is, likewise, we were talking about associational life of caste in political sphere when it comes to hissedari. Then, when they sit on the table in question of negotiations, it's not in that sense hierarchical. So caste, in some sense, many people would argue, is no longer caste. It was something else, and now it has become something else. Having recognized, I've worked on all these things, but I think a closer look at it, the more I work on caste, and more I realize how significant the subject is, and how actively it survives. And now there are kind of two broad formulations which I want to kind of discuss. And my argument is that most of the popular academic as well as activist, including Dalit activist framings of caste and its future and its discussions, is trapped in a kind of moral language. The moment we think about caste, we kind of feel embarrassed about it, we feel bad about it. There's a point that many people have made, and they kind of somehow assume what the empiric reality of caste is, because it is a bad thing, because we think it is Varna hierarchy, because we think we already know everything about caste. So at some level, we take the empirical accounts of caste for granted, and that kind of accounting, or that kind of empirical imagination of caste, presumed empirical imagination of caste, is based on its foundational conceptualization. And its foundational conceptualization is obviously an Orientalist conceptualization, which was interlocuted by the Brahmin. And this conceptualization of caste completely associates it with Hindu religion, which is presumed to have been the traditional lifestyle and belief system of nearly all the population of the subcontinent, and it has continued to be since time immemorial. And this is a kind of assumption which is very widely shared, and even those who are Christians and Muslims and Sikhs, they are assumed to have been once Hindu, right? And if you are Hindu, then you are embedded in that Brahmanic ideational system. And the second popular assumption about caste is that caste has something to do with the village life, and village life is everywhere a kind of similar Hindu village life. The Hindu village has one set of caste, and then it is surrounded by other set of servicing caste. So our notion of village, and this is something that I've done separately, I've published a book recently on Indian village, where the normative village that anthropologists and sociologists, but also economists studied, is a Hindu village of multi-caste villages, which is empirically a flawed assumption, completely flawed assumption. But that is something which is textbookized, and that kind of remains a kind of source of popular kind of common sense. I'll try to wind up in next 10 minutes or so about kind of my take on caste in very, very brief kind of few slides. And I draw from my work on caste. I didn't start working on caste initially. My work on caste starts around turn of the century. 1999, I started a survey of rural settlements in Punjab, and then after that I've been working on caste. There's a lot of other historical, empirical literature that has come out in the last 25 years. Very interesting kind of work. And there is what I describe as post-nationalist and non-Orientalist framing of the South Asian region, particularly India, which is also reframing religiosities of India, which are popular with which academics know, but I think there's still long way to go to able to enter into textbooks of social sciences. Particularly, I see when economists start working on caste, they take that kind of aspect for granted. They think of caste as SC/ST in one category, OBC as another category, and then they would kind of parallel it with the Brahminical structure of Varna hierarchy, Brahmin, Kshatriya, Shudra, Vaishya in between, and then untouchable and stuff like that. So that kind of, they think that it is all right, and that can be worked out at the national level because you have data sets available, and it reinforces the same Orientalist colonial view of caste. So my argument is that caste persists, and caste persists not as an identity as it is generally understood. We were talking about caste exists, but it doesn't exist. It does exist. It exists because it persists as a structure of ascription-based hierarchies, and this is something that I've worked on. When I use the word ascription-based hierarchies, it means it is a structure of power and domination and of inequality, and its language is that of hierarchy, discrimination, and institutionalized humiliation. So look at this language I'm trying to use is a kind of secular, double quote, language to describe caste. Caste is normally in textbooks of anthropology is always taught through Hinduism. We can and we should. We need to talk about caste in a language which is not kind of exclusivizing it to particular kind of Hinduism. I'll explain this why I'm doing that. So caste is about institutionalized humiliation, and as the citation was reading, and this institutionalized humiliation is not unique to India. It is not unique to Hindus. Not that Hindus don't have it, but it is something that allows us to think of caste as a useful comparative conceptual category through which we can understand inequalities in different contexts. So caste is always institutionalized violence. It is not something that we can say that, yeah, I'm proud of my caste. How does it matter? It matters if it is caste. You can be proud of your family. You can be proud of yourself. You can be proud of your identity. But the moment say that I'm proud of my caste because it's a relational structure. And as a relational structure, it institutionalizes all these things. So my problem with the existing literature is, which I divided into two categories, which is one is what one would call as the eternity thesis. This is my language. And this is something which has been very, very popular, and particularly with Dalit activists, and also with anthropology and many other scholars of India, which kind of try to look at India as an exceptional category. And many of them are actually critiques of caste system, but they feel much more comfortable with this Orientalist imagination of India, which presents India as a Brahmin-centric culture. And that Brahmin-centric culture also, in some sense, even if it is critical, it centers the Brahmin in all the imaginations of India. And this is an imagination on which a lot has been written, starting with Bernard Cohn, Nicholas Dirks, and many others have written, and I kind of go along with their work, and they've shown how this was at some level institutionalized by the colonial rule, and nationalists in some sense turned it into a common sense, and how Indian nationalists found colonial and Orientalist framings of India useful, because on that basis they could visualize as a singular India, and that India was the Hindu India, and that India was the India of Indian village. So in my book, I have a chapter called "The Village as the Nation." So Gandhian idea of nation. But the fact is that India was always urban. It was rural, but also, I mean, that's a separate question again. But the point is that those imaginations were accepted uncritically by the nationalist leadership across spectrums, modernists as well as traditionalists. They all worked with those framings, and they tried to produce a Brahmin-centric singular view of India. And I'm underlining the word singular, where every Indian who practices caste is ipso facto also a Hindu. This recognizes no history and presents caste as an apolitical structure. This is a very important point, because if you look at literature on development after independence, caste was recognized as being very significant, but in the literature on poverty, caste is not really seen as relevant variable, right? Caste was not politically actionable. Caste was part of tradition, which was to go away. And because Ambedkar had that agreement with Gandhi in Pune, so they had to give reservations and quotas. But otherwise, people like Nehru, who even when they were well-meaning, they didn't think of caste as being politically actionable. Caste was not something that needed to be dismantled. Caste had to be lived with for some more time, and with urban technology, it would automatically go away, because after all, caste was a tradition, and other traditional structures will go away. So its singularity also implies that it leaves no space for any kind of diversity, either outside Hinduism or within Hinduism. Outside Hinduism, if you are a Muslim, then you were once Hindu and then converted to Islam. If you are a Sikh, then you are essentially an Oriental, an Indic religion, but you are kind of, a sect which is reformist, which is not a bad idea. So you have this whole kind of, to begin with, an Orientalist imagination, but also a very popular right-wing imagination. Dalit activists too, at some level, find this as a convenient kind of way of framing Brahmin Dalit dialectics, right? Untouchable, touchable dialectics. And one of my friend Gopal Guru, I remember in 2012, I was doing a special issue of this journal called Seminar, and in that I had a section on conversations on caste, where I spoke to 5 or 6 social scientists. It is available online if you want to look at it. And when I asked Gopal Guru, what is the temporal context of caste today? So I'm not sure whether moment of caste is the right description here. The word moment has an element of temporality to it, whereas caste is an experiential reality. It operates in its own universe with a Sanatan quality to it. In its essence, caste remains Sanatan, even though it maintains some kind of change in its appearance. The universe of caste involves both continuity in its essence and change in its expression. Now, Gopal Guru is a friend and he's very respected political scientist, very good work. But at some level, he also reinforces this thesis, which kind of looks at caste as a term. There are many others I've quoted in my paper. You can look at it, but that's kind of very popular. Second, which has been very popular across a wide range of social scientists, is this modernity of caste. I think it starts with Rudolph's famous book on political modernization of India, travels through Rajni Kothari, but then comes down to even D.L. Sheth and my former colleague Dipankar Gupta, and many others, they kind of say that India's modernity is different because India is different. And India is different because India has caste, India has Hinduism, India is culturally very different. And they all, in some sense, they say that the underlying structure of caste has changed. For example, Rudolph said that, once you have associational life of caste, caste becomes a civic institution. Like you have other associations in political democracy, caste can also work as a pressure group. So caste is not really caste. Rajni Kothari would say that when caste enters politics, the reverse also happens. When the reverse happens, caste also becomes democratized. When you have internal elections and stuff like that. So caste is not really caste. Like my colleague Dipankar Gupta said that caste exists as an identity, but as a structure, it has disappeared. The hierarchies don't exist. Untouchability doesn't exist. I am proud of being what I am. So these are parallel structures. This is like Kaviraj said, equality of castes, not equality of individuals. So in some sense, caste has gone away. Now this is kind of very problematic. Some people would call it as ethnicization of caste. So if you look at actual closely, the reality of caste persists, and it persists as an experience. It persists as a reality, as any other relational structure exists. And my own argument is that if we have to look at caste as a relational structure, we also need to look at the materiality of caste. By materiality, I don't mean that caste is class. By materiality, I mean the moment you have a relationship is a structure. MIDS is a relational structure where you have a director and you have a driver. The relationship between the two is not simply a question of your mind. It is also in terms of salary, it's also in terms of honor and status, it's also in terms of responsibilities. So the moment caste exists, it exists as a relational structure. As a relational structure, it involves kind of questions of hierarchies, which are not open hierarchies. You can have an organizational hierarchy like MIDS, where we enter through individual merit in a formal structure, but in the larger structure of society, when you have caste, it kind of reproduces certain structures of inequality. So caste continues to matter not merely because it persists as an abstract cultural value, but because it also shapes social relations on the ground. As a relational process, it is shaped by local histories, political power, and economic realities. This is where I argue for diverse structures of caste, because local histories have shaped caste. I don't understand Tamil Nadu, honestly. I mean, unless I sit here and work for 3 months, 4 months, and read out a lot of literature, only then I will be able to make out. I'm still not able to figure out what is this, what is that south and the right side and left side castes. I mean, this language doesn't belong to me, and I tried to figure it out. But unless I come and do my field work, I will not understand the language of caste in Tamil Nadu. Communities have different languages, and caste histories are very different. Tamil Nadu was the first state to have non-Brahmin movement. But what does non-Brahmin mean? It's not a sociological category. It's not a kind of generic word. It is specific to Tamil Nadu's history. We don't have non-Brahmin movement in UP or Punjab or even in states like Maharashtra, right? So when I talk about caste in Punjab, I know that I'm talking about caste in Punjab. My work starts with Punjab because I thought I need to begin with my own context. Caste exists in Punjab very actively. Last week, we have had very serious crisis for last 3 days in the Sikh establishment. And it is because of one of the Akal Takht Jathedar happens to be a Dalit, and they have thrown out one senior Akali leader from Akali Dal, and that power is embedded in the Jathedar. And because he happens to be a Dalit, and the Akali leaders are not willing to accept that verdict, because who the hell is he to give me this order that I should be thrown out of Akali Dal? So, but the local histories shape caste. Likewise, if you go to Bengal, it has a different language, it has a different history. The partition of Bengal is very different from partition of Punjab. So the manner in which Dalit migrate from Bangladesh into West Bengal is again producing a different kind of hierarchical structure. But that doesn't mean caste is absent. That doesn't mean that it is the same Hindu Varna hierarchy. So as a relational process, it is shaped by local histories, political power. That's why Tamil Nadu has become so critical. I mean, the Dravid parties mean a different kind of social structure, and also economic realities, the kind of economic opportunities you have and stuff like that is something that we all know. It is not necessarily evidence of continuation of complete hegemonic presence of Brahminic religiosity. And this is where I kind of very strongly argue that Brahminic religiosity is one specific culture of the subcontinent. It does not encompass everything that exists in India, that was claimed by Louis Dumas and is accepted by lots of well-meaning social scientists even today. So there are plural histories of caste, and we need to recognize that. Finally, to conclude, asking a question about the possible futures of caste also raises questions about the nature of caste itself. The biggest challenge that one has to deal with is the framing of caste as a religious practice of the Hindus of India. Wherever you have discussion about caste in California, if they publish textbooks and they want to introduce caste, they would have this singular view of caste, and caste in India, all the Hindus live, and there are these Brahmin, and there are untouchable, and there are 2 or 3 other categories in between, which kind of becomes quite a problematic for the local Indians living there, that this is what you have. Its complete equation with a specific religious system ipso facto also implies that the ideological dictum of Brahminical Hinduism represents the eternal collective mind of all the Indians and foregrounds the Brahmin-centric view of India, a point that I've already made. This view is empirically flawed and politically restricted and misleading, and perhaps also, malicious. It ignores the diversity and fluidity of caste as it is lived on ground, and this is not talking about 20th century or 21st century. Even in the 7th century, caste was very regionally specific, and any historian would tell you that. The ideational or ritual life of caste has always been embedded in the material processes, explained it in my paper, as all relational structures invariably are. This is not to suggest that Brahminic Hinduism was not a reality in the past or that it does not represent a reality today, but it does not encompass everything and everyone in this region of the world. Caste perhaps also precedes Hinduism. This is a point that Ambedkar also makes. It exists even where Brahmin is absent. In Sikhism, there's no Brahmin, there's no ritual caste. But all communities, all Shramanic religions in India also had caste. Jains also have caste, Buddhists also have caste. So that is something which is then outside the purview of explanation of caste. We don't really consider that when we are literature, we are trying to study caste. What about texts like Manusmriti? Does it have any value? My argument is that yes, it does have value. It continues to be an effective, what I call as ideological signal that recommends and legitimizes hierarchy, discrimination, and humiliation. Now, Manusmriti is not a religious text of the Hindus. I don't think any Hindu ever worships Manusmriti as we would worship Guru Granth, or Islam is for Muslims. If you burn Manusmriti, Hindu sentiment is not hurt. Right-wing Hindu political sentiment might be hurt, but otherwise, who cares about Manusmriti? But it continues to be referred to. It becomes a kind of, or other Shastras and stuff like that. However, if you look at Manusmriti, it doesn't describe caste. It talks about Brahmin, Kshatriya, Vaishya, Shudra. People living in Nagarkoil, if there are 2 neighbors, one of them is a Nambudri and the other one is a Nayangar, I don't think they belong to the same caste, right? Do they? Right? They would never have any relationship with each other in terms of, they're both Brahmins, right? But they are very different kinds of Brahmins. And you ask any Nambudri or ask any Nayangar, for them, Nambudris are like as alien as a person from Brazil is, right? So they would not have any kinship relation with a Nambudri. Is Brahmin a caste? What is Brahmin, right? So I think these are kind of things that a person like me who does empirical work is bound to raise. And if a foreigner is going to this village of Nagarkoil, she is likely to encounter these situations and would find it completely incomprehensible. Right? So it doesn't provide a sociological meaningful explanation of caste, nor does it describe caste. It has no category of untouchable. Shudra is untouchable as well. The way we interpret that's not what Manusmriti says. So we need to recognize the materiality of caste as a relational structure of inequality. And here again, my final point, and since it is MIDS and we are talking about economics, inequality is something that's where we need to come to if we have to talk about caste. We are talking about inequality quite a lot. After Thomas Piketty, everyone is working on inequality, but economists' work on inequality remains kind of confined to wealth and income. wealth and income is only a reflection of inequality. All this inequality, any economist will tell you, inequalities of wealth and income are also mediated symbolically. Even when they're not mediated symbolically, the new kind of symbolic structures are created so that wealth becomes symbolically meaningful, right? So inequality by definition is a symbolic relational process. Only then it becomes relevant to me. Otherwise, one person has billions of dollars and is staying on moon or wherever. It doesn't matter to me. It's only when it begins to structure relations, begins to structure settlements, begins to structure emotions and identities that it becomes inequality. And therefore, any discussion of caste is not possible without talking simultaneously about economic disparities. And economic disparities are meaningless to talk about unless we also look at its symbolic aspect. And inequality has to be also conceptualized symbolically. And that's where I think economists need to do much more work and take the symbolic word empirically rather than take it for granted that when we talk about caste, it means the following 4 varnas. And within 4 varnas, you have data available on SC/ST. So then we are working on the margins of caste hierarchy. I think within SC/ST, there are lots of variations, and this is the kind of thing that he was talking about on census. So I think empirical also needs to be engaged with ethnographically. Thank you very much. I think I've taken longer than I was supposed to.